So hello everybody. Hello Moti. Welcome. We're doing this this video series on the worker proposals, and today we're going to be going through the ECAF proposal for funds. So we have Moti with us. Moti, welcome.
Hi, Yves. Thanks a lot for doing these. Really appreciate the effort. Yeah.
So Moti, the format in these typically is that you will take the lead. You'll go through the proposal, you'll share your screen, and you'll go through the proposal. And as we go along, Moti has agreed that I'll be interjecting, and we'll do a little bit of back and forth. So we'll go through the proposal, we'll go through the budget, and any questions that arise out of that, and or questions that were sent beforehand, we'll go through, and we'll try to keep this, Moti, around the hour mark. So at some point, maybe we'll either speed it up, because these tend to go long. There's a lot of information. So the idea, again, is not to debate whether or not there should be ECAF. That's a completely different question. What we're going to be looking at today is the proposal that you submitted, and whether or not there are areas that we can clarify so that the token holders can make a better informed decision when it comes time to vote on the proposal.
Okay, great.
So the floor is yours, Moti.
All right, okay, so I'll start sharing my screen now.
All right, we'll adjust the things.
Just increase the size. Okay, so you can see my screen there.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so, well, this is ECAF's request for funding from the worker proposal scheme. I'll just go through it, reading through, and if there are particular points that I think I need to draw out, then I'll mention them. And as we've discussed, Yves, if you want to interject with questions, then very happy to hear them.
Excellent.
So yeah, just as a summary. So well, we're looking to have an official organization that functions as a default arbitration body for EOS, and we need to fund, hire, and train arbitrators to work in this organization. So currently, all of the people that are working on ECAF are volunteers, and they've put in a lot of effort, but going forward, that is unsustainable. They need to pay bills. ECAF as a body needs to pay its bills for various things that it's doing, and yeah, so we need funding to put that organization in place.
And just for clarification, Moti, how many people currently are working for ECAF?
Yeah, so we have 6 interim arbitrators. Interim because they still have to go through a referendum to ratify them. But yeah, we have 6 interim arbitrators, and then there's myself and a couple of others, advisors, as well as people that volunteer their time on an ad hoc basis to either maintain the systems or do deep web development, etc.
Thank you.
So roughly, on an order of 8 to 10 people are contributing their time to ECAF right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so the funding is intended to increase the number of arbitrators. It's going to also be used to conduct a training course for them, and we can look at a bit more in the budget what that would involve. And then form a long-term organization. Part of that is to have a long-term organization that fits the goals of what we're trying to do, which is to have a decentralized arbitration forum, plus also to have an organization that will indemnify the arbitrators and the forum members from actions by, well, off-chain courts.
And I would imagine that a part of your budget is going to be going towards that indemnification of, so I would imagine that a part of your budget is significant towards legal fees.
Yeah, so there's legal fees for forming an organization, right? And so when we're looking at, we're not talking about your normal, let's say, limited company, which depending on your on your jurisdiction or your country is fairly cheap nowadays to form. What we'd be looking at is more alike to a foundation of some sort.
Okay.
It's a non-profit organization. It has no shareholders, and also would also potentially act as an umbrella body to sister organizations or alike sister organizations.
Okay.
So all of that, it does require, a proper lawyer to look at the jurisdictions, to identify which is the ideal place to form such an organization, look at the kind of structure that needs to be put in place, etc. And all of that costs, legal fees. So that's one part, setting up the organization. Then the second part is once that organization is set up, putting in place some sort of indemnification to protect arbitrators. Now, arbitrators, by virtue of the arbitration agreement, are immune from liability as if they perform the services as an arbitrator correctly. So they're not biased, they're not, they have no conflict of interest, etc. They're independent. So long as the arbitrators perform their function correctly, then they're immune from liability. But immunity from liability does not mean immunity from prosecution. So they could still be faced with lawsuits where somebody alleges that the arbitrator did something, even though the arbitrator performed their functions absolutely correctly, but somebody might allege that they didn't. And that needs to be defended. And typically when we're talking about defending, we're talking about defending an off-chain law. Of
course. And so there's money, and I will get into it later, so I don't want to fast forward ahead, but there's money that's going to be put aside. There's money that's going to be put aside, requested for the incorporation portion.
Yes.
And one is legal fees that are funds that will be put aside for that in possible indemnification in the future should a case be brought forward against one of the arbitrators. So that's more of a monthly portion. So we'll have a one-time piece and we'll have a monthly piece, correct?
Yes, that's right. So as you've said, there'll be a one-time for the incorporation, and then we basically start doing some sort of self-insurance, if you like, where we put aside money into a pot, which is labeled the legal defense fund or whatever you want to call it, and that pot just builds up, and that's, and allows us to draw from it in the eventuality that we do get one of our arbitrators.
Yeah, and when we get to that portion, I've got a couple of questions. So
sure.
Yeah, it'll be interesting because that's, I think, is one of the interesting core aspects of this proposal is obviously the legal fees of it all.
Okay, sure. Yeah, we can definitely cover that. So that's the, if you like, the starting up and indemnification part. And then the next part is around infrastructure. So right now we have, some infrastructure. We have a claims management system, a basic one. We're running our current disputes through it, but there's a lot of inefficiencies in how we're doing that. And it's not transparent, right? So that claims management system is, you need an account to log on to. It's not, people file their claims directly into that system, and that's the whole system is not transparent. We want to move to one system that allows us to be more efficient in how we are running the whole arbitration process, and that helps later on with scalability. And the second is we want to start doing things on chain, doing more on chain. So that requires us to, one, improve our processes, and then the second is actually develop the concept of an arbitration smart contract that allows certain actions to take place to take place and be logged on chain.
So I would imagine that this system that you're envisioning would be developed in-house. This is not an off-the-shelf product.
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, the arbitration smart contract. I mean, it's an EOS arbitration smart contract. There's not much that exists right now. I know there's a couple of other companies that are working on Ethereum-based ones, but for EOS, there's nothing that exists. So we are looking at developing that as part of this project. With the claims management system, right now we're using an off-the-shelf software, and we envision potentially augmenting that, or at a later stage, not including this proposal. At a later stage, we could actually have a bespoke system built
specifically for your needs. Okay. Excellent. Let's go through. Yeah.
Great. So we are asking for 298,000 EOS. When we go through it, we'll see it's actually denominated in fiat. That value fluctuates over time, but we expect to be paid out in tranches based on the EOS value at that time. But we can go through that.
Sure. I've got a question before we proceed, Moti. This is a question that was brought up to me on several occasions from our community. So 2 months, relatively 2 months or 3 months ago, you came on a BP call and you had presented a proposal from ECAF, and the proposal was I believe it was requesting, it might be off on the numbers slightly, but roughly 795,000 for 4 months, 795,000 US dollars for 4 months. And right now you're requesting roughly 1.5 million for 6 months. Can you explain why the double the increase, which is effectively doubling the previous request for an extra 2 months? That doesn't add up. So what's up with that?
Yeah, so it's non-linear. First of all, it's non-linear because so there's a lot of weighting on the upfront, right? But that doesn't account, you're right, for the doubling. So the first thing is that we in that initial proposal, I believe we had fewer staff and fewer arbitrators, right? So we've actually, as we've evolved over time, over the last several months, we have understood, we carried out an analysis of the kind of activities that we envisage ECAF to be doing for the next 6 months, and realized that we do need more arbitrators, more staff to carry out what we envision our project to be. So that's the second thing. The third thing was that was really presented as a extremely lean budget, right? Which didn't allow for a lot of flexibility in what ECAF could accomplish. With this budget, we're really looking at something that we think that will benefit the whole chain, will allow ECAF to accomplish what it's, the goals that it set out, and have a number of arbitrators that we think is a good starting point.
So I would imagine that, so I thank you for answering that. I guess it does answer that now that you've had more data, 3 months in, you have a better understanding of perhaps what your needs are and what the needs of the ecosystem are, which enables you to deliver a more thought out, maybe more detailed budget. So are there any possibilities that in 3 months' time, what you're requesting in terms of 14 arbitrators will not be enough? Because there's this issue of scalability that is brought up quite a bit. Did you envision in this particular proposal, currently what is being proposed, room for growth compared to what is actually perhaps required at this very moment?
Yeah, so this is it's an interesting, it's a good question, and by the nature of arbitration. So if we look at what arbitration does, which is what we're trying to solve here, is to resolve disputes that can't be resolved in any other way. And so by that nature, it's especially with a chain and a project that is changing very quickly. So the kind of activities that people are doing on chain is evolving very quickly. So initially was only individual token holders, and then BPs doing economic activity. As we progress, we start to see DApps. So the kind of activity changes, and by that nature, the kind of dispute changes. So unless you can tell me, like, oh yeah, for sure, in 6 months' time, there will be this DApp and that DApp, and we can then think about what kind of issues they have. Nobody can tell us for sure, because it's hard to predict the future, right? What kind of DApp development and what DApps will be coming on stream. Then it's hard for us to predict what kind of disputes, and therefore hard for us to predict the caseload, which is what all these centers on. So if we had years of history, then I could tell you, Yves, yeah, based on the last 2 years, we have these many cases, etc., and that's why we need this many arbitrators. But we don't have that case history, so we have to make a projection. Now, right now, yes, we we don't have a lot of scope for increasing arbitrators. What we do have is actually scope that if the chain activity picks up, the dispute activity picks up, then we can potentially, we'll also be getting fees coming in, and that can offset the funds that the worker proposal scheme has put in. And then that, those fees would then allow us to perhaps reinvest in additional arbitrators or reinvest that in new development. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess you just answered one of my future questions, which I asked Jay and David in the first two part of the video series. Mm-hmm. If you do have funds that are left over, in the sense that funds that are not being used, David was very clear that those funds would be returned back to the worker proposal savings fund, for example, or wherever they come from, the actual account. Mm-hmm. In your case, the funds would be reinvested into, so you would not be returning funds should you run a surplus, correct?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, that's my vision and my view, but this needs discussion with the worker proposal system. It just needs perhaps discussion with the community. I would say we have two scenarios, perhaps. So one scenario is, let's say at the end of 6 months, ECAF is well on the way to being self-sustainable. So, we're making, we've invested in our program, we've been successful, we're making, fees, we're making, the arbitrators are getting paid, etc., and we have a surplus. So then at that stage, there's a decision to be made, which ECAF will take in conjunction with the community, which is to say, should ECAF give those funds back to the worker proposal system for redistribution, or would the community prefer ECAF to keep those funds and reinvest those in things that would benefit ECAF and by extension the community, right? So that would be a discussion to have, yeah. But then there's another scenario where ECAF is perhaps partially on the way, so not really fully self-sustainable at that stage, but on the way partially, where it still has, a shortfall. So then that scenario would be, would look at it and say, well, what is the shortfall? Does that mean that we, perhaps need to request additional funding from the worker proposal system, or we just keep with whatever we have in our coffers at that stage?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think going through the proposal, I mean, essentially this is what we've just discussed here is a bit meat around that, which is that, right now we're hearing cases that are primarily, I think 70 to 80% centered around lost property, right? But then we're also starting to see additional types of cases that are related to DApps, right? And I do agree with the whole concept of making things scalable. But let's say I come from a system engineering, old school system engineering approach, which is, first of all, you do the least scalable system, understand what the bottlenecks are, and then start tuning those bottlenecks until you're able to improve the whole system. So rather than doing premature optimization where you just say, well, I think theoretically this is the bottleneck, and then, and that might not be the case. So what here we have, like, these rightful owner cases are right now the large proportion of our caseload. So our processes, initially can be tuned to improve the efficiency of handling those cases. And then as we start getting other disputes, then we can start to, build out efficiencies to make handling those other disputes more scalable. So building that, starting with a lean dispute arbitration system, and then building that out.
Moti, so in reading this portion specific, it brings up something that I've read before, where people say that, as you state here, the large majority of cases are rightful owner property restoration case, which stem from the fact that we had an Ethereum ERC20 token that got ported into, and there was a snapshot, and now you have this EOS mainnet token, and a large portion of the cases, the majority of the cases, are stem from this particular transaction, or this particular change between one to the other, and the process that occurred at that time, fictitious scams, etc. Do you envision that it is possible that the majority of cases are a one-time deal because of this particular reality of ERC20 to now EOS. And once those cases are resolved, the number of cases would significantly lower, and you would be stuck with 14 arbitrators in this particular proposal that would not have any cases to work on.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So so in terms of those cases, so you're right. There's a class of cases which are ERC20 related, and those probably, I think, if I think back to our caseload right now, is probably like maybe on the order of 25-30% perhaps.
Okay.
Then,
so it's not that large. So when people are saying that it's the majority of cases that stem from that particular period, 25 to 30 is and this is actual data. So it's not at all in the 70-80%.
No. So this 70-80% groups a whole bunch of things which are related to basically ownership of an asset. So it also groups people who lost their tokens, right? Not the tokens, sorry, lost their keys.
Yeah.
Right, for some reason or the other, they didn't save it properly, or the hard drive crashed, etc. People who have been phished subsequent to the launch of mainnet, right? So that that will probably still be an ongoing concern, right, as we go forward. People will still, especially when the ecosystem right now is developing and people are not sure which applications to trust, which websites to trust. People will get phished, and yeah, so there's still, there's still quite a proportion of those cases which are unrelated to the mainnet distribution.
I guess the majority of them are not related to the mainnet distribution. If you're saying
yeah, there you go,
25 to 30, then it's
70,
it's 70 to 75% are cases that stemmed after the conversion and since mainnet launch. Correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
And just also another point that I want to make, which is, the arbitrators are not paid a standing salary, right? Their arbitrators are paid for work that they have done or work that they are doing, right? So if an arbitrator is idle, either because they are not able to take on more cases for whatever reason, or there are no cases to be assigned to them, then effectively that there's no payment to that arbitrator. So that would then bring you to the point of building up a surplus, perhaps. Right? Yeah. So yeah, but I think this is a point that people perhaps, it needs clarification in terms of how the cash flows flow in this kind of organization. So if you think to what happens when a case is received. So a case is received, it's assigned to an arbitrator, and then the arbitrator does an amount of work, right? And that, let's say the arbitrator he does 20, 30, 40 hours of work on a case. Now, the arbitrator can't be paid from any deposit or any bond or whatever that the parties to a case give, because those funds are held in escrow pending the outcome of the arbitration.
Pending the outcome, yeah.
Yeah. So if an arbitration case takes, up to, let's say, 6 months or whatever it is for a complex case, then those funds that the parties to the case have deposited with the forum are locked up for that period, and they can't be used until the case has been determined. So the forum has this problem. It's sitting on conceptually some deposits, some that the claimants have put in to start their case, but it needs to pay its arbitrators, right? And funds to pay the arbitrators need to come from somewhere. Otherwise, the arbitrators are working for free for 6 months while the case is being determined. Yeah. So that's why, when we look through the budget, there's quite a large allocation for arbitrators, case managers who work on contingency. Basically, they work on cases and are only paid when they're working on cases, and they need to be paid in advance of cases being determined.
So when we're talking about these cases, Moti, and I don't want to get too much into that, but these cases, are they large enough in value to justify the perhaps 6 months period before rendering a ruling or an opinion?
Yeah, so let's say some in some ways, it's not. Yeah, so there are some cases which are large enough in value that complexity rather, right? So it's not really, it's more tied to complexity. That mean that that they could take that long. But then we also have other peculiarities within the arbitration process. That means that even if the case was for one EOS, it would still take a certain amount of time before it's resolved. So think about, for example, a very simple case. Somebody said, "I lost my key," or somebody took my key, fished it out. So in that case, well, we know one party, we know the claimant, but we don't know the respondent, and we don't know what. And the peculiarities of EOS means that we don't have a way of actually contacting the respondent in a in a guaranteed fashion. Yeah. So we need to build in some process in the arbitration process. We need to build in some delays that gives the respondent time to see that there's a notice, see that they need to respond to an arbitration case, etc. And that would mean that the case takes long just because of the fact that it has these gates built in to allow somebody to be able to go and say, well, ECAF issued a notice on its official account. It sent a memo to this EOS account. We need to build in, let's say, for example, hypothetically, 30 days for that message to be, to say that it's been out there for long enough that the respondent has seen it. And, there's these gates that need to take place. So that even a very simple case, because of the nature of the platform, means that it could actually take a long time, even though there's not a lot of work involved in doing that.
And through this proposal, Moti, is there any room or do you envision ECAF making decisions as to whether or not they would take cases? I'm a claimant and I say that my one EOS has been stolen. Is ECAF currently taking on my case for one EOS? Or in the future, do you envision taking on a case for one EOS if it potentially means 6 months of arbitration time? Is that something where at some point there's going to be a process or a decision made through this proposal to say, if it's not of X value, it's simply, we cannot go through this because there are to be too many cases? Or is ECAF envisioning through this proposal, through its 14 arbitrators, optimally 14 arbitrators at the end, going through every single case that is brought up to them?
Yeah, so by virtue of the nature of ECAF, where we're looking to be the default layer of arbitration, that effectively means that ECAF, at least if it's to fulfill its community mandate as it is right now, should offer services to everybody that requests them, right? Because otherwise, if there's no redress for people, that there's no other option for them, right? Then you're basically saying that, in small token holders, well, sorry, you're screwed, right? ECAF, I don't think will draw, say that we won't take these cases on. But then, there is a cost to running cases, and that decision will have to be left to the claimant. So if you come with a case for, let's say, notionally one EOS, and at the end of, let's say it's at the end of this process, ECAF has streamlined its process enough that that the current cost has gone down, but it still costs, let's say hypothetically, 50 EOS to run your case. Well, then that decision is presented to the claimant, which is, you have a case for one EOS. It costs us 50 EOS to resolve. Do you want to go ahead? Now, there could be reasons that the claimant, economically, that doesn't make sense. But maybe the case is, the claimant is alleging that, for example, I'm not saying this has happened or this will happen, that the claimant alleges that a BP, did something wrong, but, they don't want any damages from that case. It's one token damages, it's just notional
symbolic.
Damage. Symbolic damage, exactly. And so then they still want to run the case, even though it costs 50 EOS to run, because, there's a wider principle involved. So, but yes, it will be up to the claimants in those cases, that whether or not they still want to continue with the case when they're presented the facts of how much it's going to cost them at the end.
And you mentioned earlier that right now there's a case management system that is being used. And if I recall, you've mentioned quite a few times that currently the cases are being processed on a first in, first out basis. With what you mentioned earlier in terms of building perhaps something in-house and being able to resolve more cases, would you continue to operate through this proposal on a first in, first out, or would there be room, based on what we just discussed, to perhaps reallocate the cases, perhaps make a judgment as to how to reallocate the cases, so you would no longer operate on a first in, first out, but more so on a priority basis, perhaps? It's not maybe the right principle or the right term, but would you change, or would it still continue being a first in, first out type of system with what you're proposing right now?
Yeah, no, I think it makes sense to, the basic principle is PSs are resolved on a first in, first out basis. But then, as you've said, it makes sense to consider that there's an additional layer on top of that, which is a priority-based layer, right? Where, for example, this is where currently emergency cases come through, right?
Okay.
So if some, there's an imminent loss of tokens and it's, the arbitrator judges that the claim is valid, they go through this emergency process. Now, as we go forward, maybe that extends a little bit where, for example, if there are cases where there's, imminent community interest, that means that it's better for the chain for it to be resolved sooner rather than later, then, we could have an additional prioritization of those cases. So generally speaking, to answer first in, first out, but, we could have, like, for a couple of scenarios, priority layers.
Thank you.
Okay, and then going on with the proposal, there's this part here, which is monitoring and reporting the state of dispute resolution. So that line there is really, to think first of all about what ECAF is doing right now. We do want to be able to issue regular reports about the status of ECAF's work, right? Now, we're not doing that at the moment. I mean, it's, we're basically, like a shark or whatever, who I think I've heard, they need to keep moving to keep water through their gills, right? So we're running
on fumes as well as one that I've heard of.
Exactly, that's another way of putting it, right? We're running on fumes. So these are things that we would like to do. Issue regular reports about, like, for example, the statistics I've given you, perhaps dig into those a bit more, saying how long each cases took, or how long each category of case took, that kind of thing, to give people a sense of more how efficient ECAF is in resolving cases. But so we want to do that for ECAF, but then at a later stage, there's perhaps, if we have additional either sister forums or other forums cropping up, then that could be something that potentially, ECAF as a base layer could also provide monitoring and reporting of, well, not monitoring is not the right word, but at least reporting of the status of dispute resolution on EOS, right? Yeah.
And does that include being somewhat of a thought leader? So is there money in this proposal that's going towards somebody sitting down and thinking about this and thinking about, you mentioned earlier that because you come from a old school software engineering background, where the idea is to get something out and build that MVP and then determine where the bottleneck is. But is there room in your budget to be able, and in the proposal, to be able to have somebody sit down and think of how dispute resolution should perhaps proceed based on what ECAF is seeing? And develop that thought process for the governance of dispute resolution going forward?
Yeah, and that's what we envisage, absolutely. And it's not specifically broken out, and maybe that's something that we could do to improve the proposal. But we do envisage, as you said, providing thought leadership about how dispute resolution can evolve on EOS. Putting in place based on our experiences, putting in place good practices and socializing that with the rest of the community, because I mean, at the end of the day, we want, everyone who is involved wants to build a governed blockchain and to the best of our abilities. And if there's something that we've learned that can help other forums like DApp level forums that, that are being discussed, that can help them in having a more efficient resolution process, then we want to share that, right? But yeah, and conducting user surveys, DApp level, DApp developer surveys, to understand what kind of activity they're doing, how they would like to engage with arbitration, etc., and dispute resolution. All of that sort of user research, socializing concepts, thought leadership, it does take time. And that's one of the activities we think that ECAF should also be doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I've basically just said that it costs time, it costs money. And then, I mean, in the long run, really, we don't expect to be, necessarily funded through worker proposals indefinitely or for a very long time. We expect to be self-sustaining at some stage. And that will be through charging of fees. I mean, people who have, contact with ECAF, or have seen some of our output have recently seen that, we started charging for fees. And that's the first step of becoming self-sustaining.
Thank you. So I guess now we get into the meat and potatoes, which is the proposal details.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I can quickly talk about the high-level milestones, and then we could go through, maybe I'll jump back and forth to the budget as we
Sure. And I think what's important as well is that I'm hoping that a lot of our viewers are going to take the time to read perhaps more line by line, but you and I maybe can talk about the general high level purpose and or intent with the proposals. That way you give an insight on where you're coming from a premise background or from an intent background to be able to develop and present what we're seeing on the screen here.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, definitely makes sense to do that. Yeah. So initially, I think we talked a little bit. So the goal is that we want to have a long-term legal entity. So it's a non-profit foundation of some sort with no shareholders, and having, if you think about the concept of an arbitration forum, it's basically formed by, essentially the rules it has as well as the people. So we would envisage the arbitrators being, members of this foundation, right? With a governing council, perhaps, composed of a few people, eminent people in the space, perhaps people with arbitration knowledge, with online dispute resolution knowledge, etc. That would govern the operations of this foundation and really set it up such that then it can continue running with the goals of furthering dispute resolution on the mainnet. Then the indemnity fund. So we talked about that. And we can just quickly jump through that to the budget.
Yeah, and I've got questions about that in terms of the indemnity fund. At first glance, for some, this might seem large. I'm thinking this is really small. Can you explain, I guess I'm setting the tone, why 10,000? Because I think for some people, this might seem excessive, whereas I would be in the class or in the side of people that would think that this seems really small. $10,000 will not get you many hours worth of legal representation. I don't know where you're based and how much legal fees are where you are, but $10,000 in Canada will go away in a couple of days potentially. Maybe even a couple of hours, depending on who you're paying.
Who you pay, exactly, the caliber of the lawyer.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And this is one of those things where for some people it's too little. And if you talk to the lawyers, definitely they'll tell you it's too little. If people looking at it individually, be like, wow, 10,000, yeah, that's a lot, right? I could do a lot with $10,000 if you gave it to me. But so we've tried to strike a medium, which is to say that this is money that's put aside monthly in an eventuality, right? So it builds up over time. Now, and yeah, so that pot builds up over time. Now, I would say that, you know, I have had this question from other people, which is, why don't you just get liability insurance? And the answer to that is, you know, due to the nature of what we're doing, you know, blockchain arbitration. I've talked to people, brokers, people who provide arbitration liability insurance, and they're not willing to do that right now. They can't quantify the risk. So we need to self-insure in this way. So yeah, so this funds, yeah, arguably it could be small in some instance, but we're expecting that as it builds up over time, that, you know, eventually it gets into a large enough pot that allows us to defend ourselves.
And I would imagine that it's like any insurance. The idea is you never want to use it.
That's right.
And you want the arbitrators to be doing as good of a job as possible. This is the last resort fund, correct?
Yes, correct. Yes, yes. And I mean, you know, even if the arbitrators are doing the perfect job, you know, when you're resolving disputes, arguably there's always one party that's unhappy. And that party might just decide, well, for the heck of it, I want to make someone's life difficult. So, you know, I'm going to file a lawsuit, right? Even though it gets thrown out on the first day, as you said, you still need to pay the lawyer to show up.
You still need to show up.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so then we want to expand the forum staff, right? So there's a few categories of people that we require.
So the forum staff are not the arbitrators, correct?
Yeah, exactly. These are administrative staff, if you like. And they're not basically people who are involved in the day-to-day running of cases. So in day-to-day running of cases, you have case managers and arbitrators. So the arbitrators do the final decision, and effectively the case managers assist the arbitrators through that whole process, doing effectively any background research that's required, contacting the respondents and claimants, collecting, you know, potentially even collecting fees, all of the work that, you know, the arbitrator will outsource to the case manager, make sure that they're freed up from, you know, and can focus on deciding on the legal and merits of a case. So
can you explain why, I mean, I have an idea why, but can you explain why you are expanding the forum staff prior to expanding the arbitrator volume?
Right. Yeah. Well, hopefully they will go to some extent hand in hand. But in any case, if you look at what we need to do as a forum, we need to first of all handle the inflow of cases, right? So we already have cases, right, and more will be coming. So we need to be able to handle that, which is why, and then we need to be able to communicate to people around what we are doing. You know, we've seen the community is very sensitive to ECAF's operations, rightly or wrongly or whatever. But you know, we do need to be transparent. So we need to communicate what we're doing. We need, you know, if we're getting a large pot of funds, we need people to control those funds, right? We have IT systems already in place that are, you know, that need to be either improved or maintained. So yeah, all of this is being done by volunteers right now, right? And you know, their patience is limited, and you know, we do need to get permanent people doing all of these activities. Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, so in terms of the kind of work, so if we look through the profiles, casework, admins, so people who are looking at just managing the flow of cases, perhaps doing some of that reporting work that we talked about, some of that monitoring, preparing reports, doing some initial triage before they get past to case managers. You know, we talk about communications, finance, yeah. Essentially, unless there's particular questions, these, I think, would be the basic you'd need for any kind of organization that's involved with a large, you know, large number of incoming customer inputs, has IT infrastructure, and wants to develop additional IT infrastructure. I mean, I don't think it's, you know, some people could even say it's not enough, right? But, you know, for the starting phase, I think that's the minimum you probably end up needing.
And these are currently positions that are either being done volunteering and or do not exist currently. So this would be a significant add-on to ECAF's current operations, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So either people are volunteering their time, or in some cases we have had companies or friends of ECAF prior to main launch who volunteered their efforts to fill in some of these holes, or they're basically being heavily multiplexed by one or more individuals, which is not sustainable. Yeah. Okay. So then the next thing that we want to do is, as you said, we want to increase the number of arbitrators. So we have 6 right now, and 6 is not necessarily a number that we settled on. It just happens that actually it does take time to get people to nominate arbitrators and then vet them, etc. And we do want to have more arbitrators. Even right now, we could do with more. But the goal is that we want to increase that number to 14. And the reason we settled on 14 is that with arbitrators, we want to have one regional diversity. So regional from the point of view of, well, we need to be able to respond to cases almost on a 24/7 basis, right? So you do need people across different time zones. We want to have language diversity. So we have a big constituency in China, Korea. Some cases, in some instances, we also start getting cases from Japan. And we're not covering, even right now, we're not covering for Latin America and maybe even the Middle East. So if you look at having like a couple of arbitrators covering at least those, being able to cover English as well as these other language communities, you get to a number which is roughly in the order of 14 or so, which we think is a good number in terms of regional and geographic diversity, and also in terms of at least the kind of caseload that we project having. And then so we then have 14 arbitrators, and then we basically have for similar reasons 7 arbitrators, 7 case managers, sorry, which is a 1-to-2 ratio of arbitrators to case managers. So one case manager could help service 2 arbitrators potentially.
And is that standard in the industry, or is that something that you have realized and or determined is a good ratio over the last couple of months?
Yeah, so this is from our experience, right? Which is, it seems that from what we've seen over the last few months, that is a good ratio. Yeah. And then there's the other thing that we have is putting in place the requirements for the arbitration smart contract. So if we look at, you asked, I think, a question of why we wouldn't develop the smart contract immediately. And I think what we want to do is get those requirements in place. So we have some ideas right now, but they all need to be formalized. There also needs to be, a process of, talking with several suppliers, or at least if we're going to be doing that externally, or recruiting the developers if we're going to take that on, those developers on internally. So this is basically in this first phase, there's a lead up, right, to the development. So requirements gathering plus people, etc. And then we're in the second phase, ready to kick all of that off.
So currently you believe that, I guess if you're looking at this, could at this month mark, so once you're elaborating the requirements for arbitration smart contracts, could you determine at that time, so 3 months in, that it makes no sense for ECAF to take this on and you would decide to outsource this to someone else? Is that a possibility? Or is the vision always to build it in-house as currently proposed?
Well, currently proposed is actually outsourced.
Okay.
So the opposite would be, we might decide to take it in-house. So if we look at the budget, it says outsourced development of the arbitration smart contract. Yeah. I think the question here is, where are the best people? Are the best people lying around waiting for, a company, people who have EOS smart contract development skills, which I think there are very few of them. Where are they? Are they waiting around to be hired, or are they sitting in an organization that offers their services? And that's I don't have an answer. Perhaps somebody in the community does, but potentially I think right now those people are not, few and far between, and probably in demand. So
they're not sitting in the ECAF offices at this point, just waiting.
They're not in the ECAF offices right now. I can tell you that for sure.
Okay.
We don't have offices, so.
Thank you for the clarification.
Right. But looking like it will be outsourced, but if it makes sense to bring it in-house, then do.
And so the rest of the proposal goes in further detail for the arbitration smart contract. So unless you particularly want to go over this, I think it's fairly well explained, and based on what we've talked about for the last little while, I think you've already explained this portion. The final, I guess, phase 2 really just delves into that smart contract. So if you want, unless you particularly want to go over those lines, I think where we could go now, seeing as I'm not sure exactly how much time we're in right now, maybe 40-minute mark or so, maybe we could go into the budget itself and go through the budget, because your budget is particularly well detailed in terms of, it seems as though anyways, more precise costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have tried, we do realize that we are asking, the community for a large amount of money. And, with that, there's expectation, rightly so, that we need to account for how we're going to be using that money. So yeah, we have tried to detail our costs to quite a level, which may make it harder to read, but I'll go through that now. I think, the summary budget is fairly self-explanatory.
Yeah.
It's when you go into the details that things.
Yeah, because I think your budget is split into two. Well, it's in a way split into two. There's the one-time cost in the beginning, and then there's the monthly cost. And you really laid it out separately. Here's what we're asking for at first at T0, but then here's what we're asking at T1 to T6.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So if we go through that format, I'll just start off with the one-off cost. These are going to happen only once in ECAF's formation. There's corporate registration fees. Now, depends on where you are. If you're registering in an offshore haven, those fees are lower. If you're registering in Switzerland, they're higher. So we've taken and we've talked to lawyers in these different jurisdictions to get a sense, and that's roughly an average.
And do you currently have an idea of where you would be registering, or is that part of what the legal advice for incorporation as a nonprofit would provide?
Yes, so that is part of the advice that the law firm that we would retain would provide, which would be to look at a few jurisdictions. We have, to our mind, several places that could be favorable. So, for example, there's the default that people seem to, at least, in the last 6 months ago, Switzerland was the default. So that could be one option. Ireland is another option, which has benefits. And then there's some of the other, other offshore havens, not havens, but offshore locations. For example, Anguilla or the Virgin Islands, So there's several options. And if you start, we did this exercise initially, and there's always pluses and minuses of every location. And, it does need somebody with a bit of, knowledge of what we are trying to do, knowledge of international law, to sit down and say, well, based on what you're doing, then, this would probably be the best fit, given your pluses and minuses. Yeah.
And do you currently have either a legal firm or a particular individual in mind that would be providing this advice? Because if I'm looking, again, like the $20,000, if I'm looking at, from personal experience, the legal advice that we've received to incorporate as EOS Nation, $20,000 seems really low to be able to provide advice on something as complex as what you're proposing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have talked to, at least, you're right. This is on the low end of that budget, right? I mean, certainly if you go to Switzerland, $20,000 is not going to give you that.
That's what I'm thinking, yeah.
Yeah. So this is on the low end of that budget, yes. But it's sort of mixed, because starting capital, so if effectively you could.
Okay, and that was my next question, yeah.
Yeah.
So what is the starting capital going to be used for? So that's more of a, there's no precise function for that $50,000, is to give you leeway just to get things up and started. So
well,
it could be used as legal fees?
Yeah,
or is there something else specifically for that $50,000? Because it is, I'm not a big fan of round numbers like this, because it seems arbitrary. Yeah.
So this is, if you look at foundations across the world, because foundations have, are a peculiar form of corporate structure, typically you find that a lot of jurisdictions mandate that a foundation needs to have a minimum operating capital on its balance sheet.
Okay.
So even to get started, you need to deposit, for example, I think in Switzerland, as an example, you need to deposit 50,000 Swiss francs to start a foundation.
Yeah, but so again, that number then seems very low.
Well, yeah, so, but then if you look at, for example, I think Anguilla is another example, the starting capital is 10,000.
Okay.
Right, so what we've said is that, this bucket, depending on where you are, will, where the costs are apportioned, it might be there's more on the legal advice, and then because you chose
on the minimum starting. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a bucket of $70,000, which would be used either, mixed legal advice plus starting capital.
And what happens if you need more than that? So let's say the legal advice is done by a Swiss lawyer, so your costs double, and the advice is to register in Switzerland, and then the minimum starting capital is $200,000 in Switzerland, or whatever it may be. Have you already looked into this in order to be able to provide this number, or can this number potentially fluctuate so much that you'd be able to take away from another bucket somewhere down in the budget?
Yeah, so no, we have looked into this. Over the last few months, we've been looking at how ECAF will be incorporated, and have gotten quotes from several law firms, and looked at the choice of jurisdictions. So this is, it's something that's on the average, I think, of costs, right? Yeah. Thank you.
I know there's no specific answer until you actually get that legal advice. It's just, I would fear that as ECAF, you come back to the community after, let's say this were to pass, and you come back 3 weeks later and say, unfortunately, community, we underestimated these costs, therefore we need more money, and or the funds that you've given us only permit us to function for 3 months instead, or whatever it may be. I guess, but I did get the information from you. What you're saying is you've already gone out, you already have a rough idea, you've already consulted, you've already done some legwork that give you that gives you an insight on the information that you need to be able to present this particular, in this instance, $20,000 and $50,000. So
yeah,
thank you.
And I mean, at the end of the day, it will come down to well, basically prioritization and risk management, I suppose, which is where we would say that, for example, in the eventuality that we got a quote, or the lawyer that we retained ended up costing more, right? Then we could say that, well, okay, we potentially pay more for this advice, right? In this instance, and then set up they would come out with a recommendation which would say, you need to do this, this, and that, and then we would have to have a look at that recommendation, which is say, well, perhaps we start off with, again, minimum viable incorporation, right? Which is frank, to be honest, what we have right now. So ECAF recently incorporated a limited liability company for this interim period, right? So that's our MVP of this moment. It's a limited liability company.
Okay.
Right? And then again, we would have to look at the situation later on. Maybe it's not incorporating in a preferred jurisdiction, but or using that different form. I'm sure there will be options that will be presented to us, and then we'll make a decision based on those options.
Thank you. The next one, okay, so I've got a question on this. So the arbitrator training, and this is one question that's come about from the community quite a bit. I did some research, and the Canadian Arbitration Association has fees of roughly $200 to $800 an hour per arbitrator.
Sure.
And then they have expedited fees. And anyway, so the cost of arbitration is quite high. And I believe that in your proposal, if I'm not mistaken, your arbitrators would be making roughly $700 per hour. Is that correct?
Well, not really.
I guess the average is 160, but I thought I got 700 somewhere.
Okay, no. So I think what we have is we have put in place right now a structure which has minimum and maximum arbitration fees. So I think the maximum we have right now is about $300.
Okay. So yes. My question, regardless of that price, the specific details, $7,000 for a virtual course to train an arbitrator is ridiculous. Can you explain about that? So how can I pay $7,000 and then suddenly go make $300 an hour? How is that? I don't know how long that course lasts. Is it a month course, a week course? How can that prepare me to then entering into this arbitrator gig? It seems something doesn't fit for me. So please explain what this course is, who's delivering this course, why is this called a professional course? Just talk about this for a little bit.
Sure. So let's perhaps go rebase the discussion a little bit. So to be an arbitrator, I mean, and I think this depends on where you are, where you're based. But for example, if you look at a lot of the common law countries, to be an arbitrator, you don't necessarily have to have a legal qualification, right? So, for example, I have an engineering background. I could be an arbitrator on particularly engineering-based cases, right? So leveraging my engineering knowledge with an arbitration background to then be able to arbitrate on these cases. So that's rebasing that discussion a little bit. And then the next thing is that we've termed it as a professional development course, because the arbitrators that are our interim arbitrators are already receiving, on the job effectively mentorship and training right now, right? As they're hearing cases. They're hearing cases, they have questions, they get feedback from our advisors, and they're building up those arbitration muscles, if you like, already, right? So this professional development course then is really intended to round that all out, right? And build up on some of the experiences they've already had in taking cases through, and make sure that they have a foundation that would enable them to look at additional, the evolution of cases that we expect to come through, right? So $7,000 doesn't necessarily mean that after $7,000 you'll be like, yeah, I can arbitrate and rule on every single dispute that comes across me.
I'm good to go.
Yeah, it's not the case, right? We still will be leveraging our advisors as well as legal experts to help make sure that the arbitrators are able to rule on the disputes. And this is why another question, depending on who you ask, $160, well, that's a lot, right? It's a good salary, right? Or if you talk to arbitrators, they're like, what? I don't get out of bed for $160 an hour, So but so we've that's an average. There's a minimum, and the arbitrators will be charging at that minimum. And of course, as they gain experience, then they will be able to potentially would have then different pay scales depending on people who have had much more experience, have had much more experience with complex disputes, etc.
And so this course, I guess, just one last thing that you didn't touch on, is this course delivered by so it's a virtual course. Is it a virtual course as in somebody's on the other side delivering the course, or is this an online course where
No.
it's a prepackaged software? And if
No.
it's somebody on the other side, is this being delivered by a professional arbitration body, I guess a professional arbitration association, or something of the likes? Who is on the other side of this virtual course?
Yeah, so it's virtual in the sense that it's not, we do have trainers, and you have this line here where you have trainers, so it's a 1-to-2 ratio. So effectively, each trainer would be able to work with 2 arbitrators. And the reason it needs people on the other side of this course is that the part of this is, it's not just like, pumping information, like you sit through and click through a multiple choice exam at the end. No, part of it is that there will be some elements of theory, but a large part of this kind of course is actually running through example cases where, you have, it's basically how you do, for example, business school study, where you have case studies. It's the same thing that, you'd end up doing with this kind of arbitration course. So the trainers would be working with each arbitrator, a couple of arbitrators, to go through case studies. In terms of trainers, what we are looking at is professional arbitrators who have primarily got experience in technology-based arbitration. So not obviously, blockchain arbitration, not many on those on the ground, but at least with technology-based.
And these would be, so you mentioned earlier, the number 14 current arbitrators is a good number because you cover regional differences, cultural differences, language differences. Are the trainers also diversified in their cultural, language, and region diversification, or are they all trainers in Europe or the United States, or how do you go about this portion?
Yeah, so, and that's a good question. Right now, at least let's say it's probably weighted towards Europe, but we would be looking to having people from, for example, at least some of the major language communities, one each.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just say that, this is benchmarked towards similar courses that we've seen. So for example, there's one by the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators in Australia. They do a similar course that comes in at about $6,000. So it's not, otherworldly. This is,
And this is a 1-week course, right? Just to reiterate.
This is a 1 week, or 1 week equivalent, right? Initially, the proposal had it as everybody flying in at the same time.
That was my next question, yeah.
That would have been, the ideal, but, that would end up costing much more, right? Because you need to pay flights, you need to pay hotel accommodation, etc. So we've settled on, on the virtual course, which means that, there's 1 week contact time, let's say, but obviously you can't sit on a computer for 1 week, right? Too draining. So it'd probably be spread out over a couple of weeks or so.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's at least with the one-off costs.
Yes.
And so we have that figure there, and then we come to monthly costs.
Yeah, and I don't think we need to go through the unless you really want to justify the $9 for email and the $59 for help desk.
Don't you really want to know
software fee? I think that the viewers can, if you really wish, you can go through those numbers yourself. I don't think that that's where there's a lot of perhaps questions that are going to be stemming from. If you do have questions as to whether or not $9 for an email account and or $750 because you can get it, I don't think we really need to debate $252 on a $1.5 million budget. I think where maybe I would like to spend more time, unless you absolutely want to, Moti.
I don't.
Bottom portion, because this is really well laid out. We've already talked about, so even that, I don't think we need to go through one by one. But one thing that I find is particularly interesting is that it's not simply, if we look at admin, for example, you're not saying I necessarily need one full admin. You put it at a 0.5 FTE, a full-time employee. And so you do break it down based on, it is incredibly precise, I guess, is what I'm coming to, is that it's not a 1-for-1 ratio. There are different ratios If the community wishes, you can go and ask specific questions in terms of why the executive director would get paid $14,583 if you so wish. But I don't really think there's value for this particular portion. So I'm good with this, but Moti, is there anything that you want to give in terms of high level that you think would be important for the viewers and the audience to understand looking at the budget overall, this particular portion?
No, nothing in particular. I mean, I think the only thing is just to, there's a tranches, which we haven't talked about, but we have, if you look at the bottom there, that's what this section is trying to draw out. So initially we would request a 3-month tranche. And the reason for that is, well, getting the funds upfront, there's quite a heavy upfront cost that we need to pay out. And then it allows us to then just make sure that we have enough operating capital to get the whole program started. Thereafter, after the initial 3-month tranche, we can move to a 1 monthly tranche.
Month-per-month basis, yeah,
for the second phase.
And of course, those numbers are currently presented in EOS numbers at a valuation of, I think it was 470 or 495, there you go. But really, you are presenting these numbers effectively in fiat conversion, and that number of EOS would fluctuate based on the needs at the time. And so one question that was asked and that we did broach upon with David and Jay in the other video series is, I often get the, when EOS moons and then EOS is going to be worth $1,000 and now we're going to be giving billions and gazillions of dollars to ECAF. This is incorrect, right? You would be adjusting based on the EOS valuation at the time of receiving that particular payment, that particular
exactly correct. Exactly, yeah. I mean, ECAF, we're not in the business of making money from the token appreciation, right? I mean, we have a budget that's set in US dollars, and we just like that covered in whatever the equivalent EOS amount is at the time that the funds are released. Right?
Okay, thank you. So I think, well, I mean, is there anything we're getting on? I think we're a little past the hour mark or at the hour mark. Is there anything else that you want to go over before we end this series? And I want to mention, first of all, thank you very much for participating in this, Moti, taking your time and running us down the proposal, running us through the proposal. I want to mention as well that, as I said to the other 2 participants, depending on the questions that stem from this video, on the interest that is gathered from watching this video, it is possible that I will ask you to come back and answer questions. Because I think, as I mentioned before we started, some people like to consume their information through video, and just going through this hour with you, I've learned some things, and I think that I'm hoping that the viewers and the audience will have learned something in terms of this proposal itself. Again, the idea is not to go through to debate whether or not ECAF should exist, whether or not base layer arbitration should exist. The idea is there is a proposal in front of us. These proposals will create the baseline should worker proposal funds continue to exist, because that's even another question. But this will create the baseline in terms of what is being presented in the future. We will always look back at these first proposals. So I think there's value in ensuring that these proposals are clear, they're understood, and they really set the benchmark for what could and should be done when a particular team or individual proposes something to the community going forward. So again, if there's anything in the future, perhaps we'll do a part 2 of this. But on your side, Moti, is there anything that you want to say in terms of closing remarks, or is there anything else that you want to go through before we end this this particular video?
No. I mean, I think I think we've covered a lot, and as you've said, Yves, at the end, if I'd be happy to come back on board if and have another video call if there are particular questions, there's particular areas that people really think that, well, actually you weren't very clear on that, or we need some more feedback. I think we want to shed light on this proposal. If there's feedback that improves it, great. We're really open to doing that. So thank you for organizing this.
Excellent. So Moti, again, thank you very much for participating in this call, and looking forward to, Moti is going to be in London, so looking forward to see you when I'm in London at the end of the month, and maybe by then I'll be able to ask you questions directly in person.
Oh, there we go. Maybe off the record.
All right. Take care, Moti.
Thank you.
Thank you.